There are creatures in the Pokemon world that occupy a space between the ordinary and the divine, beings so powerful they rival legendaries, yet remain accessible to those willing to search. They are called pseudo-legendaries, and their strength comes not from myth or prophecy, but from patience, from training, from the slow accumulation of power across 3 evolutionary stages. Each generation has introduced one of these extraordinary lines, dragon-typed beings who share a base stat total of 600, the same threshold that defines mythical Pokemon. They are rare, difficult to evolve, and demand levels of dedication that most trainers never reach. Yet for those who persist, these creatures become companions of unmatched capability, guardians born not from legend, but from devotion. And before we drift any further, make sure to subscribe and tell me where you're watching from tonight. The first pseudo-legendary appeared in the earliest days of the Pokemon world, a serpentine creature discovered beneath waterfalls and hidden in colonies beneath the waves. Dratini was so rare that people believed it to be mythical, a dragon whispered about but never truly seen, until explorers found entire communities living in underwater sanctuaries. These delicate creatures shed their skin continuously as they grow, lengthening their bodies through cycles of renewal that leave them vulnerable and exposed. During these molting periods, Dratini retreat behind cascading water, using the roar of falling streams to mask their presence from predators who might exploit their fragility. The shedding is not just growth, but transformation. Each layer of discarded skin, a memory of what they were, each new surface, a promise of what they will become. Their bodies shimmer with an iridescence that hints at the energy gathering within them, a latent power waiting for the moment when evolution can no longer be denied. In the early games, encountering one required fishing with a super rod in the Safari Zone, a combination so unintuitive that many trainers completed their entire journey without ever seeing this dragon. The rarity was intentional, designed to make each sighting feel like a myth confirmed, a whisper proven true. When Dratini grows strong enough, it transforms into Dragonair, gaining elegant wings along its neck and a pair of crystalline orbs on its throat and tail. These crystals are not decorative, but functional, storing vast quantities of energy that allow Dragonair to manipulate weather patterns across entire regions. Agricultural communities in ancient times offered tributes to these dragons, hoping their fields would be blessed with rain during droughts or spared from storms during harvest. The Pokédex describes how Dragonair releases energy from these orbs to alter atmospheric conditions, creating gentle rains or dispersing ominous clouds, depending on the needs of those who show it respect. Its serpentine body moves with a grace that defies its size, undulating through air as easily as water, and those who witness a Dragonair in flight often describe it as witnessing something sacred. The connection to Hermes in Greek mythology becomes apparent in Dragonair's design, with small wing-like protrusions near its head resembling the helmet of the messenger god, and its long body echoing the twin serpents coiled around his caduceus staff. This blend of Eastern and Western dragon mythology creates a creature that feels both ancient and timeless, a bridge between two traditions of understanding power and divinity. The final evolution comes when Dragonair reaches a level of strength and experience that triggers a dramatic metamorphosis into Dragonite, a transformation so profound that it shifts from serpentine elegance to something more imposing and grounded. Dragonite gains arms, legs, and massive wings, adopting a form closer to European dragon depictions than the Chinese dragons that inspired its earlier stages. This shift in design philosophy puzzled some players initially, but it speaks to a deeper truth about evolution in the Pokemon world, that growth sometimes means abandoning what you were for something entirely new. Dragonite's intelligence is said to equal that of humans, allowing it to understand complex situations and make decisions based on empathy and moral reasoning. Many Pokédex entries describe how Dragonite patrol coastlines, watching for ships in distress and guiding lost crews back to shore through storms that would otherwise prove fatal. They dive into churning seas to rescue drowning sailors, their powerful wings allowing them to carry multiple people to safety without strain. This guardian behavior is not trained, but instinctual, as if the evolution into Dragonite awakens something protective and compassionate within them. The speed at which Dragonite can travel defies reasonable expectation, with Pokédex entries claiming they can circle the entire planet in just 16 hours. To accomplish such a feat would require sustained speeds that break the sound barrier multiple times over, yet Dragonite moves with such smoothness that those riding on its back describe the experience as peaceful rather than violent. The wind parts around its form, creating a pocket of calm that allows passengers to breathe and observe the world rushing beneath them. This speed becomes particularly meaningful when considering Lance, the Dragon Master, who serves as both Elite Four member and later champion across multiple games. His Dragonite became the face of the Dragon type for an entire generation of players, the first encounter many trainers had with this mysterious typing that resisted their starters and demanded new strategies. Lance famously used Dragonite at levels that should have been impossible, fielding specimens that had evolved before reaching the required threshold, a programming oversight that became part of his legend. Encountering him felt like facing a cheater who had access to power you could not yet obtain, a wall designed to test whether you truly understood type advantages and team composition. As we drift a little deeper into the history of pseudo-legendaries, the second generation introduced a creature whose power came not from mysticism, but from calculation, from biological engineering refined over centuries. Larvitar appears as a small, rocky creature that consumes soil to sustain itself, eating through entire mountains over the course of its development. This consumption is not gluttony, but necessity, as Larvitar requires vast quantities of minerals to fuel the internal processes that will eventually allow it to evolve. The Pokédex describes how a single Larvitar can consume a mountain's worth of earth, leaving behind valleys and altered landscapes that become geological markers of their feeding. This destructive consumption serves a purpose, compressing minerals into the dense armor that will protect it in later forms. Larvitar burrows deep underground to avoid predators, emerging only when it has stored enough energy to risk the surface. Trainers who find them describe the challenge of raising such a creature, as its constant hunger requires resources most cannot provide. Yet those who persist discover that Larvitar's appetite diminishes as it evolves, the initial consumption phase giving way to forms that no longer need to devour mountains to survive. When Larvitar evolves into Pupitar, it encases itself in a shell harder than steel, creating a protective cocoon that allows it to complete the internal restructuring required for its final form. Despite this shell, Pupitar remains mobile, using bursts of compressed gas to propel itself at high speeds, smashing through obstacles with enough force to shatter boulders. The Pokédex suggests that Pupitar are incredibly dangerous if encountered in the wild, as they cannot fully control these gas-powered bursts and may accidentally collide with trainers or other Pokémon while navigating their environment. This middle stage represents a vulnerability disguised as strength, a creature so focused on reaching its final form that it becomes reckless and unpredictable. Trainers must carefully manage Pupitar's development, providing space for it to vent its energy without causing harm. The shell itself generates heat as the transformation progresses inside, creating a microclimate around Pupitar that causes snow to melt and plants to wither. This thermal output is a byproduct of the immense energy being redirected toward evolution, a furnace contained within living stone. The transformation into Tyranitar is one of the most dramatic in the Pokemon world, as the shell cracks open to reveal a towering bipedal creature covered in armor-like hide, with a design inspired by Godzilla and other kaiju films. Tyranitar stands as a living natural disaster, capable of altering entire landscapes through sheer destructive capability. The Pokédex describes how a rampaging Tyranitar can change the geography around it, toppling mountains and creating new valleys as it moves. This destructive power is not malicious, but instinctual, a reflection of the energy it consumed during its Larvitar stage, now manifesting as raw physical might. Tyranitar's hide is nearly impenetrable, described as tougher than diamond, allowing it to shrug off attacks that would fell lesser Pokemon. Its typing as rock and dark gives it a unique defensive profile, resisting many common attacks while remaining vulnerable to fighting moves, creating a strategic complexity that makes it both formidable and manageable in competitive play. In later generations, Tyranitar gained access to a mega evolution that amplified its already considerable stats, transforming it into a jagged fortress of stone and rage, with torn armor spikes jutting from its back and shoulders. Mega Tyranitar becomes even more aggressive, with Pokédex entries suggesting that the energy of Mega Evolution destabilizes its temperament, making it harder for trainers to maintain control. This reflects a recurring theme in pseudo-legendaries, that their power comes with inherent risk, that wielding such strength requires constant vigilance and mutual respect between trainer and Pokémon. Tyranitar's role in the metagame has remained consistently relevant across generations. Its combination of bulk, power, and weather summoning ability through Sandstream, making it a staple in both casual and competitive play. The sight of a Tyranitar activating its ability, summoning a sandstorm that erodes opponents while leaving it untouched, captures the essence of what makes pseudo-legendaries special. They are not just strong, they define the battlefield itself. The third generation brought a creature that defied the dragon-type pattern, introducing a pseudo-legendary with a steel and psychic typing that emphasized intellect over raw elemental fury. Beldum is one of the strangest first-stage Pokemon ever designed, a creature with no arms, no legs, no mouth, and only a single move in its natural move pool. Takedown becomes the only option for most of its early levels, forcing trainers to endure a grueling training process where their Beldum repeatedly damages itself just to deal damage to opponents. This intentional design choice creates a barrier to entry that makes raising a Beldum feel like an endurance test, a deliberate challenge that separates committed trainers from casual ones. Beldum's body is composed of magnetic cells that allow it to levitate and navigate through electromagnetic fields, communicating with others of its kind through pulses of magnetic energy rather than sounds or gestures. In the wild, Beldum congregate on mountain peaks where magnetic fields are strongest, forming loose colonies that drift together in silence. When two Beldum evolve simultaneously, they fuse together to form Metang, a process that is less evolution and more merger, two consciousnesses combining into a single entity with twice the processing power. Metang gains 2 additional arms and increased mobility, but more importantly, it gains the ability to think in parallel, using its dual brains to calculate battle strategies at speeds that confuse opponents. The Pokédex describes how Metang can analyze multiple scenarios simultaneously, predicting enemy movements and formulating counterattacks before the opponent has finished their action. This hyper-analytical approach to combat makes Metang a terrifying opponent despite its middling stats, as it rarely makes mistakes and capitalizes on every opening. Trainers describe Maytang as eerily silent, communicating intent through body language and magnetic pulses rather than cries, creating an unsettling partnership where words become unnecessary. The connection between trainer and Maytang is built on understanding rather than affection, a mutual acknowledgement of capability and purpose. The evolution into Metagross occurs when two Maytang merge, creating a four-brained supercomputer housed in a body resembling a metallic spider or tank. Metagross represents the pinnacle of synthetic evolution, a creature that is more machine than beast, calculating every variable with cold precision. Its four brains work in perfect synchronization, allowing it to process information faster than any organic mind could achieve, and the Pokédex claims its intelligence surpasses that of supercomputers. Despite this cold mechanical nature, Metagross forms genuine bonds with trainers who prove themselves worthy, protecting them with the same ferocity it would apply to solving a complex equation. The typing of Steel and Psychic creates a defensive profile that resists 11 of the 18 types, making Metagross one of the most resilient Pokémon in existence. Its signature move, Meteor Mash, strikes with the force of a falling star, a Steel-type attack that occasionally raises its own physical attack stat, allowing Metagross to snowball into an unstoppable offensive threat. Champion Steven Stone made Metagross famous by using it as his ace, a partnership that defined the Hoenn region's endgame challenge. Encountering Steven's Metagross for the first time left an impression on countless trainers, as its combination of bulk, power, and speed made it a seemingly unbeatable wall. The shiny version of Metagross, which trades its blue-gray coloring for silver and gold, became one of the most sought-after variants in the series, a color scheme that emphasized its mechanical perfection. When Mega Evolution was introduced, Metagross gained a form that increased its speed dramatically and made it even more overwhelming, with additional limbs extending from its body to create a more aggressive silhouette. Mega Metagross moves with a ruthless efficiency that reflects its nature, every action calculated for maximum impact, every decision optimized for victory. It became a symbol of what pseudo-legendaries could represent beyond dragon types, proof that power could manifest in forms that prioritized logic over instinct. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off, and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the 4th generation's contribution to the pseudo-legendary roster, a line that returned to dragon typing but added ground into the mix, creating a predator designed around raw physical dominance. Gible burrows through sand and cave systems, using its massive jaws to carrierly bite through anything that gets in its way, from rocks to the legs of unsuspecting prey. The Pokédex describes Gible as clumsy and uncoordinated, often tripping over its own feet during battle, yet its bites are powerful enough to crush steel. This contrast between awkwardness and lethality makes Gible endearing despite its predatory nature, a baby dragon that doesn't yet understand its own strength. Trainers who raise Gible from this early stage often describe it as affectionate in a rough way, nuzzling with enough force to bruise, and playing with an intensity that borders on dangerous. The key to training Gible is teaching it restraint, helping it understand the difference between sparring and genuine combat before it accidentally harms something it cares about. Evolution into Gabite brings with it a more streamlined design, as the awkward baby dragon transforms into a sleek, predatory form built for speed and precision. Gabite gains blade-like fins on its arms and a distinctive head crest that cuts through air with minimal resistance, allowing it to move at high speeds both underground and above. The Pokédex mentions that Gabite are territorial and aggressive, hoarding treasure in their caves and attacking anything that ventures too close to their claimed spaces. This shift from playful to possessive reflects a maturation process where survival instincts override earlier innocence, where the dragon learns that the world is not always safe. Gabite's coloring shifts to a darker blue, camouflaging it against the shadows of caves where it makes its den. Trainers must establish clear boundaries with Gabite, reinforcing trust built during the Gable stage, while also respecting its growing need for independence and space. The final evolution into Garchomp creates one of the most iconic pseudo-legendaries in the franchise, a land shark dragon that moves through the ground as easily as water, bursting from beneath opponents to strike with devastating force. Garchomp's design blends predatory fish with dragon mythology, its head shaped like a hammerhead shark, while its body maintains the muscular build of a traditional dragon. The Pokédex describes how Garchomp can fly at the speed of a jet plane when it folds its body into an aerodynamic form, creating a silhouette that cuts through air with almost no resistance. This speed makes it a nightmare to face in battle, as Garchomp can outpace most opponents while dealing massive damage through its high attack stat. Its signature move, Dragon Rush, sends it hurtling toward enemies with reckless abandon, sacrificing accuracy for overwhelming power. Trainers who command Garchomp describe it as feral in combat, requiring careful direction to prevent it from overwhelming weaker opponents or causing collateral damage to the battlefield itself. Champion Cynthia elevated Garchomp to legendary status among players by making it her ace in Diamond and Pearl, a battle that became infamous for its difficulty. Her Garchomp was faster than most teams could handle, hitting with a combination of Earthquake and Dragon Rush that left a little room for counterplay. Trainers learned to fear the sight of her Garchomp emerging onto the field, knowing that they had mere turns to defeat it before their team crumbled. The shiny version of Garchomp, which only slightly alters its color to a darker shade, became a point of discussion among fans who felt that such a minor change diminished the appeal of hunting for it. Despite this, Garchomp remained a staple in competitive play across multiple generations, its combination of typing, stats, and move pool making it versatile enough to fit into countless team compositions. When Mega Evolution was introduced, Garchomp gained a form that increased its offensive stats further while reducing its speed, a trade-off that some players found counterintuitive, given how important speed was to its standard strategy. The bond between Cynthia and her Garchomp became emblematic of what pseudo-legendaries represent in the world of Pokémon, a partnership built over time through training and battle until trainer and Pokémon move as a single unit. Garchomp's presence in the metagame has never truly faded, even as new generations introduce new threats, because its fundamental design remains sound. It is fast enough to threaten offense, bulky enough to take hits, and powerful enough to sweep unprepared teams. The simple elegance of its stat distribution creates endless possibilities for customization, allowing trainers to mold their Garchomp into whatever role their team requires. This adaptability is the hallmark of a well-designed pseudo-legendary, flexibility wrapped in overwhelming power, accessible to anyone willing to invest the time required to raise it from Gibble to its final form. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the 5th generation introduced not one, but 2 pseudo-legendary lines, breaking the established pattern and offering players a choice based on version exclusivity. Dano begins life as a creature defined by its lack of sight, a dark and dragon type that compensates for blindness through enhanced hearing and an aggressive temperament. The Pokédex describes Dano as destructive and difficult to train, biting everything it encounters in an attempt to understand its surroundings. This behavior stems not from malice, but from fear, as the world remains a mystery of sounds and scents that Dano cannot fully interpret. Trainers who raise Dano must exercise patience, teaching it to trust through consistency and gentle handling, never responding to its bites with anger or punishment. The bond formed during these early stages becomes the foundation for everything that follows, as Dino learns that not everything in the world will hurt it, that some beings can be trusted. Evolution into Zweilous occurs at level 50, a transformation that grants Dino a second head but still no eyes, doubling its sensory input while also doubling its internal conflict. The two heads of Zweilous constantly compete for food and territory, fighting each other as often as they fight external threats. The Pokédex suggests that Zweilous cannot truly be at peace because its two consciousnesses never fully merge, each head maintaining its own thoughts and desires. This internal struggle makes Zweilous unpredictable and dangerous, as it may attack allies if one head perceives a threat the other does not. Trainers must learn to communicate with both heads simultaneously, ensuring that neither feels neglected or threatened by the other's presence. Some describe this process as mediating a constant argument, finding ways to redirect aggression toward shared goals rather than internalized destruction. The coloring of Zweilous remains dark, black fur covering most of its body, a visual representation of the darkness in which it exists without vision. The final evolution into Hydreigon is a transcendent moment where the two warring heads finally achieve harmony by generating a third, creating a three-headed dragon of immense power and strategic complexity. The central head becomes dominant, with the two side heads acting as extensions of its will, attacking independently while coordinating their movements with perfect synchronization. Hydreigon gains the ability to fly despite its heavy build, levitating through energy generation rather than traditional wing mechanics. The Pokédex describes Hydreigon as brutal and merciless, attacking anything that moves and destroying landscapes when angered. This reputation makes it one of the most feared Pokémon in the Unova region, with stories of villages evacuated when a wild Hydreigon passed through. Yet trainers who have bonded with Hydreigon from the Dino stage report a different experience, describing their partner as fiercely loyal and protective, channeling its aggression only toward genuine threats. Champion Iris used Hydreigon as her signature Pokémon in Black and White 2, cementing its status as a symbol of mastery over dragon types. Her Hydreigon moved with a viciousness that reflected its Pokédex lore, hitting hard and fast with a special attack stat that made its Draco Meteor devastating. The typing of Dark and Dragon grants Hydreigon only one weakness in Fairy types, a vulnerability introduced in Generation 6 that balanced its previously overwhelming presence in the metagame. Before Fairy types existed, Hydreigon could sweep entire teams with minimal counterplay, its only real weakness being other dragons or ice types that could outspeed it. The shiny version turns Hydreigon's black coloring to a vibrant teal, one of the more striking color changes in the series, transforming it from a creature of darkness into something almost aquatic in appearance. The other 5th generation pseudo-legendary came from an entirely different design philosophy, trading aggression for resilience and creating a Pokémon that resembled the ancient dinosaurs more than traditional dragons. Axew appears as a small, tusk-bearing creature whose fangs grow continuously throughout its life, requiring constant use to prevent them from becoming too large to manage. The Pokédex explains that Axew mark their territory by leaving tusk marks on trees, creating patterns that other Axew recognize and respect. This behavior establishes hierarchies within wild populations, where the size and sharpness of tusks determine social standing. Trainers who raise Axew must provide materials for it to gnaw on, preventing its tusks from growing into uncomfortable lengths. This maintenance becomes a bonding activity, as Axew learns to trust its trainer to care for its needs beyond just battle training. The bright green coloring of Axio makes it distinctive, a vibrant shade that stands out against forest backgrounds where it makes its home. Evolution into Fracture occurs at level 38, transforming the small tusked Pokemon into a more formidable fighter with enlarged fangs that can crush boulders. Fracture's tusks become so sharp and durable that broken pieces remain effective weapons, and the Pokédex mentions that Fracture will often snap off its own tusks to use as tools or gifts for allies. This ability to weaponize its own body parts speaks to a pragmatic approach to survival, where every part of Fracture serves a purpose beyond mere aesthetics. The tusks regenerate over time, ensuring that Fracture is never without its primary means of attack. Trainers describe Fracture as more aggressive than Axew, eager to prove itself in battle and establish dominance over opponents. The coloring shifts to a deeper olive green, with red accents along its tusks that suggest blood even though the Pokemon itself is perfectly healthy. This visual intimidation serves as a warning to potential threats, signaling that Fracture is not to be underestimated. The evolution into Haxorus creates a dragon of pure physical might, with blade-like tusks that can cut through steel beams without dulling. Haxorus represents the culmination of the evolutionary line's focus on weaponized anatomy, its entire design built around the concept of a living blade. The Pokédex describes how Haxorus are gentle toward those they trust, but merciless toward enemies, a duality that requires trainers to establish clear boundaries about battle when violence is appropriate. Its tusks are harder than diamond, yet Haxorus maintains them with care, sharpening them against specific types of stone that won't damage the edges. This ritualistic maintenance becomes a meditative practice for Haxorus, a moment of calm in an otherwise aggressive existence. The stat distribution of Haxorus emphasizes attack above all else, with one of the highest physical attack values in the game, allowing it to break through defensive walls with ease. Unlike most pseudo-legendaries, Haxorus does not have a secondary type, remaining pure dragon throughout its evolutionary line. This decision creates interesting strategic implications, as Haxorus gains no additional resistances, but also lacks the weaknesses that dual typing might introduce. Champion Iris used Haxorus alongside her Hydreigon, creating a dragon-type specialist team that showcased the versatility of the type across different stat distributions and battle roles. The shiny version of Haxorus trades its green coloring for black and red, creating a more sinister appearance that emphasizes its role as a physical powerhouse. In competitive play, Haxorus became known for its ability to break through stall teams using Mold Breaker to ignore abilities that would otherwise protect opponents from its devastating attacks. This ability negating trait made Haxorus unpredictable, as defensive players could no longer rely on abilities like Sturdy to survive hits that would otherwise end their run. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at the 6th generation's Pseudo-Legendary, a dragon that abandoned the aggressive designs of previous entries in favor of something gentler and more nurturing. Goomy begins life as a slug-like creature covered in a membrane of slime that protects it from harm while also making it difficult to hold. The Pokédex describes Goomy as the weakest dragon-type Pokémon, a creature so fragile that direct sunlight can be harmful to its delicate body. This vulnerability forces Goomy to live in damp, shaded environments where moisture is plentiful and predators are few. Trainers who find Goomy often underestimate it, dismissing the slimy creature as too weak to bother training. Yet those who persist discover that Goomy's apparent weakness hides an inner resilience, a determination to survive despite the world's harshness. The slime coating is not just protective, but adaptive, changing consistency based on threats, becoming more viscous when struck and thinner when Goomy needs to move quickly. Evolution into Sliggoo occurs at level 40, but only if Sliggoo levels up during rain or in areas with high humidity, a condition that reflects its need for moisture to fuel the transformation. Sliggoo gains retractable horns and a larger body, yet it loses the ability to see clearly as a layer of slime covers its eyes and distorts visual input. The Pokédex explains that Sliggoo compensates for this by developing enhanced olfactory senses capable of tracking prey or predators through scent alone. This evolution represents a trade-off where Sliggoo gains size and power but sacrifices the clarity it once possessed, a metaphor for how growth sometimes means accepting new limitations. Trainers must adapt their strategies to work with Sliggoo's sensory profile, issuing commands that account for its reduced visual awareness. Despite this handicap, Sliggoo remains a formidable fighter, using its bulk to absorb attacks while slowly wearing down opponents through status moves and residual damage. The final evolution into Goodra restores Sliggoo's vision and grants it a form that blends dragon strength with an unexpected softness. Goodra's body remains covered in slime, but this membrane now serves as both armor and weapon, allowing Goodra to suffocate opponents in goo or slip free from physical restraints. The Pokédex describes Goodra as affectionate and friendly, often hugging trainers with enough enthusiasm to leave them covered in slime. This gentle nature makes Goodra an outlier among pseudo-legendaries, most of which are described as aggressive or difficult to control. Goodra's emotional intelligence allows it to sense when its trainer is sad or stressed, providing comfort through its presence. This empathetic quality makes the bond between Goodra and trainer uniquely intimate, built on mutual emotional support rather than just combat effectiveness. The stat distribution emphasizes special attack in both defenses, making Goodra a bulky special attacker that can endure prolonged battles while dealing consistent damage. Champion Diantha used Goodra in her team, though it was not her ace, reflecting how Generation 6 spread the spotlight across multiple Pokémon rather than focusing on a single signature partner. Goodra's gentle reputation did not diminish its effectiveness in battle, as its combination of bulk and power made it a reliable choice for players seeking a defensive anchor. The shiny version of Goodra changes its purple coloring to a soft lavender, a subtle shift that emphasizes its gentle nature. In later generations, Goodra received a Hisuian regional variant that changed its typing to Steel and Dragon, transforming the gentle slug into a heavily armored snail with a retractable shell. This variant reflected the harsh conditions of ancient Hisui, where even gentle creatures needed armor to survive. The Hisuian Goodra became more defensive than its Colossian counterpart, trading some special attack for increased physical bulk and a typing that granted additional resistances. The 7th generation introduced a pseudo-legendary that broke from dragon typing entirely, creating a creature whose power came from fighting spirit and discipline rather than elemental mastery. Kommo-o appears as a small, scale-covered Pokémon that practices combat through ritualized battles with others of its kind. The Pokédex describes how Kommo-o strike their scales together to create rhythmic sounds, using these clattering noises to communicate with each other and establish training routines. This musical element suggests a cultural sophistication unusual for first-stage Pokémon, a society built around martial discipline and shared improvement. Kommo-o live in harsh mountainous regions where only the strong survive, forcing them to train constantly just to reach adulthood. Trainers who capture Kommo-o often find them eager to battle, viewing each encounter as an opportunity to refine techniques and grow stronger. The scales covering its body are not just armor, but instruments, each one tuned to produce a specific note when struck, creating a symphony during battle that confuses and disorients opponents. Evolution into Kommo-o occurs at level 35, granting Jangmo-o additional scales that cover more of its body and enhance the resonance of its battle cries. Kommo-o strikes its scales with increased force, creating sonic attacks that can shatter stone and disorient opponents before physical blows land. The Pokédex mentions that Kommo-o train by striking their scales against each other in groups, creating coordinated rhythms that teach them timing and precision. This communal training reinforces the idea that Kommo-o view combat as a shared journey rather than individual achievement, a perspective that makes them excellent partners for trainers who value teamwork. The coloring shifts from golden yellow to a more muted gray, reflecting the seriousness with which Kommo-o approach their training. Trainers describe Kommo-o as disciplined and focused, rarely wasting energy on unnecessary movements and always maintaining perfect form during battle. This efficiency makes them predictable in some ways, but also incredibly difficult to counter, as Kommo-o rarely make mistakes that opponents can exploit. The evolution into Kommo-o represents the pinnacle of martial discipline, a dragon and fighting type that combines elemental power with hand-to-hand combat mastery. Kommo-o's scales cover its entire body, forming a natural armor that deflects attacks while producing devastating sounds when struck with intent. The Pokédex describes Kommo-o as proud warriors who challenge strong opponents to test their skills, seeking worthy adversaries rather than easy victories. This warrior ethos makes Kommo-o a natural partner for trainers who value honor and fair competition, as Kommo-o will respect opponents who fight with courage even if they lose. The signature move of Kommo-o, clanging scales, strikes all opponents with sound-based damage while lowering Kommo-o's own defense, a move that embodies the aggressive, offensive philosophy of its fighting. Kommo-o believes in overwhelming opponents through relentless assault rather than cautious defense, a strategy that demands trainers commit fully to each battle rather than playing conservatively. The unique typing of dragon and fighting created interesting strategic opportunities, as Kommo-o could hit a wide range of opponents for super effective damage while maintaining reasonable bulk through its defensive stats. The introduction of Z moves in Generation 7 gave Kommo-o access to Clangorous Soul Blaze, an exclusive Z move that dealt massive damage, while boosting all of Kommo-o's stats simultaneously, effectively transforming it into an unstoppable force if it landed successfully. This move captured the essence of Kommo-o's design philosophy: risk everything for the chance at overwhelming victory, trust in your training to see you through. The shiny version of Kommo-o changes its gray coloring to white, creating an angelic appearance that contrasts with its aggressive battle style. Trainers who bonded deeply with Kommo-o often described it as surprisingly philosophical, contemplating the meaning of strength during moments of rest and seeking to understand the purpose of combat beyond simple victory. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the 7th generation also introduced an alternate pseudo-legendary through regional variants, creating a Pokémon whose story began not with adventure, but with tragedy. Alolan Gumi exists only in concept, but Jangmo-o's evolutionary line stands as the sole new pseudo-legendary introduced in Alola, though the islands themselves held secrets about dragon-type creatures that had adapted to tropical climates. What Generation 7 truly contributed was Kommo-o's role in exploring how pseudo-legendaries could step outside the traditional dragon archetype while maintaining the power and rarity that defined the category. The guardian deities of Alola, though not pseudo-legendaries themselves, influenced how subsequent pseudo-legendaries were designed, emphasizing cultural significance and spiritual connection to their regions of origin. The 8th generation brought us back to traditional dragon typing with a line that blended prehistoric inspiration with spectral horror, creating ghost and dragon types that redefined what pseudo-legendaries could represent thematically. Dreepy appears as a tiny, ghostly creature that zips through water at high speeds, poking at aquatic Pokemon in behavior that seems playful, but stems from instincts carried over from when it was alive millions of years ago. The Pokédex describes Dreepy as remnants of ancient sea creatures that went extinct, their spirits persisting through time because they died before fully understanding their place in the ecosystem. This existential uncertainty keeps Dreepy tethered to the world, preventing them from moving on to whatever comes after life ends. Trainers who raise Dreepy describe them as energetic and curious, constantly exploring their surroundings with an enthusiasm that belies their ghostly nature. The paradox of a creature so full of life, despite being dead, creates a cognitive dissonance that makes Dreepy simultaneously endearing and unsettling. Evolution into Dracloak occurs at level 50, transforming the tiny spirit into a sleek, predatory form that serves as both fighter and caretaker. Dracloak bonds with a Dreepy that rides on its head, forming a partnership where the older ghost helps train the younger one through shared battles. This mentorship relationship is built into the species' biology, as Dracloak becomes uneasy and distressed if separated from its Dreepy passenger, seeking to replace it with any Pokemon small enough to ride in that position. The Pokédex mentions that Dracloak flies at speeds exceeding 120 miles per hour, using this velocity both to travel and to enhance the impact of physical attacks. The relationship between Dracloak and its Dreepy represents a form of communal child-rearing, where experienced members of the species take responsibility for training the next generation. Trainers must respect this bond, understanding that their Dracloak's effectiveness in battle depends partially on the confidence and skill of the Dreepy it carries. The final evolution into Dragapult creates one of the fastest Pokemon in existence, with a base speed stat of 142 that allows it to outpace nearly everything in the game. Dragapult's design resembles a stealth bomber crossed with a prehistoric aquatic predator, its head shaped like the extinct Diplocaulus, while its body suggests military aircraft engineering. The most distinctive feature of Dragapult is how it launches the Dreepy living in holes on its horns, firing them at opponents like missiles at supersonic speeds. The Pokédex clarifies that the Dreepy enjoy this experience, eagerly waiting for their turn to be launched and viewing it as play rather than combat. This bizarre attack method inspired the signature move Dragon Darts, which hits opponents twice in rapid succession, representing the launching of both Dreepy simultaneously. Dragapult's ability to turn invisible by focusing its mind adds another layer of strategic depth, allowing it to disappear from sight and reappear elsewhere on the battlefield, creating unpredictable attack patterns that overwhelm defensive players. Champion Leon used Dragapult in his final team, though it appeared only in rematches after the main story concluded, reflecting how late-game pseudo-legendaries are often held back for the most challenging encounters. Dragapult's combination of speed, power, and versatility made it a staple in competitive play immediately upon release, fitting into offensive teams that valued momentum and aggressive positioning. The Ghost and Dragon typing granted it immunity to normal and fighting moves while providing offensive coverage against a wide range of opponents. The shiny version of Dragapult changes its coloring to pale gold and cyan, creating a more ethereal appearance that emphasizes its ghostly nature. Trainers who specialized in Dragapult developed strategy around its incredible speed, using it to set up status moves or deliver devastating special attacks before opponents could react. Over time, flocks of Dreepy began appearing around the fastest Dragapult in the wild, desperate for the thrill of being launched at high velocity, creating a strange mutualism where both species benefited from the relationship. The ninth generation introduced the final pseudo-legendary line currently in existence, a dragon and ice type that broke the pattern of late evolution levels by having its second evolution occur relatively early compared to previous generations. Frigibax lives in cold forests and rocky mountain regions, absorbing heat through the dorsal fin on its back and converting that thermal energy into ice-type attacks. The Pokédex explains that the hotter the environment, the more power Frigibax can store, creating a paradoxical situation where this ice-type creature thrives in warm climates by using temperature differential to fuel its abilities. Frigibax uses its fin to regulate the temperature inside its nest, creating a refrigerated space that preserves food and maintains comfortable living conditions. This practical application of its powers suggests an intelligence that goes beyond simple combat effectiveness, showing that Frigibax understands thermodynamics on an intuitive level. Trainers who raise Frigibax describe it as calm and methodical, approaching problems with patience rather than aggression. Evolution into Arctibax occurs at level 35, transforming Frigibax into a more aggressive predator whose dorsal fin becomes a blade of pure ice. Arctibax protects its face with a frost mask while using acrobatic flips and powerful leg muscles to launch aerial assaults, slashing opponents with its icy blade before they can mount effective defenses. The Pokédex describes Arctibax as territorial and protective of its hunting grounds, challenging any Pokémon that enters areas it has claimed. This shift from calm to aggressive reflects the increased energy demands of its larger body, requiring Arctibax to hunt more frequently and defend resources against competitors. The coloring remains primarily blue-gray with white accents, camouflaging Arctibax against snowy backgrounds where it often makes its den. Trainers must establish dominance early with Arctibax, demonstrating strength and reliability to earn its respect and cooperation. Once that bond forms, Arctibax becomes fiercely loyal, viewing its trainer as part of its territory that must be defended at all costs. The final evolution into Baxcalibur occurs at level 54, specifically chosen as a reference to the year 1954 when the original Godzilla film was released, paying homage to the kaiju that inspired much of Baxcalibur's design. Baxcalibur launches itself into the sky and releases freezing breath capable of solidifying lava instantaneously, demonstrating control over temperature that exceeds anything its previous forms achieved. The blade of ice on its back grows larger and more ornate, resembling the legendary Sword Excalibur, which inspired the Pokémon's name and thematic connection to Arthurian legend. The combination of Godzilla-inspired kaiju aesthetics and medieval European sword mythology creates a design that feels both ancient and timeless, a creature that could exist in any era and still command respect. Baxcalibur's signature move, Glaive Rush, deals massive damage, but leaves Baxcalibur vulnerable to counterattacks that deal double damage on the following turn, embodying a high-risk, high-reward philosophy that demands careful timing and strategic awareness. The signature ability Thermal Exchange perfectly complements Baxcalibur's typing and roll, boosting its attack stat when hit by fire-type moves and preventing burn status, turning what would normally be a weakness into an opportunity for offensive escalation. This ability makes Baxcalibur particularly effective against fire types who expect their attacks to deal super effective damage, only to find themselves strengthening their opponent instead. The stat distribution emphasizes attack and HP, creating a physical powerhouse that can endure hits while dealing devastating damage in return. Elite Four member Hassel used Baxcalibur as his signature Pokémon, showcasing its power during the Paldea Regions Championship Challenge. The shiny version of Baxcalibur changes its blue coloring to purple and white, creating a more regal appearance that emphasizes its connection to legendary weaponry and ancient kings. Across all 10 pseudo-legendary lines, certain patterns emerge that define what makes these Pokémon special, beyond just their base stat totals. They represent commitment, requiring trainers to invest dozens of hours, raising them from weak first forms to overwhelming final evolutions. They demand patience during the vulnerable early stages, when their low stats make every battle a struggle. They reward persistence by becoming some of the most versatile and powerful Pokémon available in their respective generations. The dragon typing that dominates the category reflects a cultural fascination with dragons as symbols of ultimate power, creatures that transcend normal limitations through sheer force of will and accumulated strength. Even the pseudo-legendaries that step outside dragon typing, Metagross, Kommo-o, and the Goodra variants, maintain the same fundamental philosophy of gradual growth, culminating in overwhelming capability. The relationship between trainer and pseudo-legendary often becomes the defining partnership of a playthrough, the ace that carries teams through the toughest battles and defines how players approach strategy. Champions and Elite Four members consistently use pseudo-legendaries as their signature Pokémon, recognizing that these creatures represent the pinnacle of what trainers can achieve through dedication rather than luck. Lance and his Dragonite, Steven and his Metagross, Cynthia and her Garchomp, these partnerships became iconic not just because the Pokémon were strong, but because they represented the bond between trainer and partner perfected through countless battles. The pseudo-legendary is not given, but earned, not found easily, but sought deliberately, not powerful immediately, but grown patiently over time until it becomes unstoppable. The designs of pseudo-legendaries often reference real-world mythology, paleontology, and cultural symbols, grounding their fantastic powers in concepts that feel familiar even when fantastical. Dragonite's connection to European and Chinese dragons, Tyranitar's kaiju inspiration, Metagross's sci-fi computer aesthetic, Garchomp's land shark concept, Hydreigon's three-headed dragon mythology, Goodra's subversion of aggressive dragon tropes, Kommo-o's martial arts discipline, Dragapult's stealth bomber predator fusion, and Baxcalibur's Godzilla meets Excalibur identity all draw from deeper wells of human storytelling and scientific understanding. These references make pseudo-legendaries feel like they exist beyond just the games, as if they could walk out of the screen and into legend itself. The competitive metagame has consistently been shaped by pseudo-legendaries, with multiple generations seeing these Pokémon dominate both casual and professional play. Their 600 base stat totals give them flexibility that most other Pokémon lack, allowing them to fill multiple roles depending on how trainers choose to train them. A Salamence can be a physical attacker, a special attacker, or a bulky intimidate support. A Garchomp can run offensive sets, defensive sets, or choice scarf builds that maximize its already impressive speed. A Dragapult can function as a physical attacker, special attacker, or mixed attacker depending on team needs. This versatility means that pseudo-legendaries rarely disappear from relevance, even as new generations introduce new mechanics and new Pokémon that might otherwise power creep older designs. The introduction of Mega Evolution in Generation 6 gave several pseudo-legendaries access to even greater power, with Metagross, Salamence, and Garchomp all receiving Mega forms that pushed their stats beyond the 600 threshold. These Mega Evolutions often emphasized the aggressive aspects of their designs, with Mega Salamence growing a protective shell, Mega Metagross gaining additional limbs and speed, and Mega Garchomp becoming even more of a physical juggernaut. The choice to grant Mega Evolutions to pseudo-legendaries reflected Game Freak's acknowledgement that these Pokémon held special places in players' hearts and deserved the additional spotlight that Mega Evolution provided. Even pseudo-legendaries that didn't receive Mega Evolutions benefited from the mechanic's existence, as it raised the power level of the entire game and forced defensive players to account for the possibility that any pseudo-legendary could suddenly transform into something even more dangerous. Regional variants introduced in later generations offered new perspectives on existing pseudo-legendary concepts, with Hisuian Goodra demonstrating how the same Pokémon could adapt to different environments and develop new typings that changed its strategic role entirely. The potential for regional variants of other pseudo-legendaries remains an exciting prospect for future generations, as seeing how Tyranitar might adapt to a tropical region, or how Garchomp might change in an Arctic environment, could introduce entirely new playstyles while maintaining the core identity of these beloved Pokémon. The designers have shown restraint in how they handle pseudo-legendaries, introducing only one per generation in most cases, and ensuring each one feels distinct from its predecessors. This careful curation has prevented pseudo-legendaries from feeling diluted or generic, maintaining their special status within the broader roster of Pokémon. The training journey from first form to final evolution creates narratives that players remember long after completing their games, stories of struggling through early battles with weak Gibble or blind Dino, then finally reaching the moment when evolution triggers and power floods into your partner, transforming it into something capable of challenging champions. These transformation moments become personal milestones, markers of progress that feel earned rather than given. The level requirements for final evolutions, often 55 or 60, ensure that trainers cannot rush through this process, cannot take shortcuts to power. The game forces patience, forces commitment, and in doing so, makes the eventual reward feel that much more meaningful. When your Metagross finally forms from 2 Metang, when your Kommo-o perfects its battle cry, when your Dragapult gains the speed to outpace anything else in existence, those moments justify the hours spent grinding experience and the frustration of working with incomplete forms. The pseudo-legendary category has become so culturally significant within the Pokemon community that players often speculate about what each new generation's pseudo-legendary will be before games release, analyzing trailers and promotional materials for hints about which 3-stage evolution line will reach that coveted 600 base stat total. This speculation has become part of the pre-release excitement, with fans theorizing about typings, designs, and potential stat distributions based on minimal information. The reveal of each generation's pseudo-legendary often generates intense discussion about whether it lives up to the standards set by predecessors, whether its design captures the essence of what makes these Pokemon special, and how it will fit into the competitive landscape once players begin building teams around it. The role of pseudo-legendaries in story encounters has evolved over generations, with early games treating them as rare optional captures, while later games integrated them more directly into narrative, moments, and character teams. The shift from optional to essential reflects how central these Pokemon have become to the identity of Pokemon as a franchise, how they represent the endpoint of the training journey in ways that even legendary Pokemon sometimes cannot. Legendary Pokemon are often given to players or encountered through story events, making them feel less earned than pseudo-legendaries that must be trained from weak first forms. This difference in acquisition creates different emotional connections, with pseudo-legendaries often feeling more like true partners, while legendaries remain powerful tools that happened to join the team. The distinction is subtle but significant, coloring how players remember their journeys and which Pokemon they consider their true aces. The design philosophy behind pseudo-legendaries reflects broader trends in how Game Freak approaches creating Pokemon that feel both powerful and balanced, intimidating yet attainable, rare, but not impossible. The three-stage evolution structure ensures players form bonds across multiple forms, investing emotionally in the journey rather than just the destination. The high evolution levels prevent early game dominance that would trivialize challenges and undermine the difficulty curve. The 600 base stat total places them above most standard Pokemon, but below true legendaries, creating a tier of strength that feels appropriate for the effort required to reach it. Every element of how pseudo-legendaries function within the game systems reinforces the idea that greatness comes from dedication rather than destiny, that the strongest partners are those you raise yourself rather than those handed to you by fate. As new generations continue to release, the pseudo-legendary tradition will almost certainly continue, with each new region introducing its own interpretation of what power earned through patience looks like. Future pseudo-legendaries might explore new type combinations that haven't yet been represented, perhaps a fairy and dragon type that represents the intersection of mythology and magic, or a bug and dragon type that explores how even small creatures can achieve greatness through metamorphosis. The potential for innovation within the category remains vast, as designers can play with different stat distributions, abilities, and movesets while maintaining the core identity of creatures that start weak and become unstoppable through training and time. The pseudo-legendary concept has become one of the pillars of Pokemon game design, a tradition that players expect and anticipate with each new generation. The community around pseudo-legendaries extends beyond just using them in battles, with fans creating art, writing stories, and theorizing about the biology and ecology of these creatures. How do wild Tyranitar survive when their consumption patterns would strip entire mountain ranges of resources? What social structures do salamence form when they achieve flight and no longer need to remain earthbound? How do Dragapult populations maintain stable numbers when their reproductive strategy involves launching their young at high velocity? These questions inspire creative exploration of the Pokemon world, filling in details that the games leave ambiguous and building a richer understanding of how these creatures might exist beyond their battle functionality. The lore surrounding pseudo-legendaries often becomes as important as their competitive viability, creating multi-dimensional appreciation that goes beyond just numbers and stats. The shiny variants of pseudo-legendaries often become highly sought-after status symbols within the community, representing not just the dedication required to raise the Pokemon to its final form, but also the luck or patience required to encounter the alternate coloration. Hunting for shiny pseudo-legendaries can take hundreds of hours, with players resetting games thousands of times or chaining encounters endlessly in hopes of seeing that sparkle animation that indicates success. The commitment required to obtain a shiny pseudo-legendary creates a double achievement, first in finding the rare coloration, and second in training it to max level, ensuring that players who possess them have demonstrated exceptional dedication to the game. These shiny specimens become conversation starters in online battles, immediately signaling to opponents that they face someone who takes Pokemon seriously enough to invest extraordinary amounts of time into obtaining and training their team. The evolution animations for pseudo-legendaries often receive special attention from developers, with longer sequences and more dramatic visual effects that emphasize the significance of the transformation. Watching Metang split and merge into Metagross, seeing Zweilous sprout its third head to become Hydreigon, observing Dreepy grow and gain its passengers as it becomes Dragapult, these animations serve as rewards for the player's patience, visual confirmation that the investment has paid off. The music often swells during these moments, adding auditory emphasis to the visual spectacle, creating multi-sensory experiences that make evolution feel like the momentous occasions they are meant to be. These animations become memorable not just for their quality, but for the emotional context surrounding them, the relief and excitement of finally reaching the goal after hours of training and preparation. The nicknames players give their pseudo-legendaries often reflect the personal stories and meanings these Pokemon hold, with trainers choosing names that reference mythology, personal experiences, or characteristics they've observed during training. A Garchomp might be named Earthquake after the move that defined its battle style, or Cynthia after the champion who made the species famous. A Metagross might be called Calculator for its methodical approach to combat, or Steven in honor of the partner that taught so many players to fear steel types. These nicknames transform pseudo-legendaries from generic species into individuals, unique partners whose personalities and histories are known only to their trainers. The act of naming reinforces the bond between player and Pokemon, making the pseudo-legendary feel less like a tool and more like a character in its own right. The post-game content in Pokemon games often revolves around perfecting pseudo-legendaries through breeding for perfect stats, training for ideal movesets, and battling against other players to test the results. The competitive breeding process for pseudo-legendaries can be particularly challenging, as their high evolution levels mean producing multiple candidates requires significant time investment. Hatching eggs, checking stats, releasing imperfect specimens, and repeating the process until achieving the desired result becomes a meditation on patience and probability. The mathematical aspects of breeding, calculating inheritance rates, and chaining beneficial traits across generations adds a puzzle element that appeals to players who enjoy optimization and min-maxing. When a perfect pseudo-legendary finally emerges from this process, it represents the culmination of two journeys: the in-game training from first to final form, and the metagame breeding that perfected its genetic potential. The role of pseudo-legendaries in the anime differs from their game counterparts, with characters like Iris's Dragonite or Ash's attempt to train a Gible creating storylines around the difficulty of controlling such powerful Pokemon. These narratives often emphasize that strength without discipline leads to chaos, that pseudo-legendaries require not just powerful trainers, but wise ones who can guide their development responsibly. The anime explores emotional dimensions that the games can only hint at, showing pseudo-legendaries as creatures with complex feelings and motivations beyond just battle effectiveness. Episodes featuring pseudo-legendaries often become fan favorites, as they showcase the spectacle of these powerful Pokemon in ways that turn-based battles cannot fully capture. The balance patches and stat adjustments that occur between generations sometimes target pseudo-legendaries that become too dominant in competitive play, introducing new counters or adjusting mechanics that previously favored them. The introduction of fairy types in Generation 6 specifically targeted dragon-type pseudo-legendaries that had dominated previous metagames, creating a new threat that forced players to reconsider strategies that had previously been reliable. These balance changes reflect the ongoing conversation between developers and players about what constitutes fair challenge and enjoyable gameplay, with pseudo-legendaries serving as benchmarks for overall power levels. When a pseudo-legendary becomes too centralizing, warping team building around its presence, adjustments ensure that variety remains possible and that no single Pokemon becomes mandatory for competitive success. The soundtrack themes associated with pseudo-legendary encounters or training montages often become beloved pieces of video game music, with composers crafting melodies that capture the epic scale and emotional weight of these moments. The dramatic orchestration during champion battles, where pseudo-legendaries serve as final challenges, the triumphant fanfare when evolution finally triggers after dozens of levels, these musical cues become inseparable from the experience of training pseudo-legendaries. Players who hear these tracks years after putting down their games often report immediate emotional responses, memories of specific battles or training sessions flooding back with perfect clarity. Music becomes a vehicle for nostalgia, connecting players across time to the experiences that define their journeys through Pokemon worlds. The trading card game representations of pseudo-legendaries often feature them as powerful rare cards with high HP and devastating attacks, translating their video game strength into physical game mechanics. Collecting these cards becomes another way for fans to engage with pseudo-legendaries outside of battles, with rare holographic versions commanding high prices in secondary markets. The artwork on these cards frequently depicts pseudo-legendaries in dynamic poses or dramatic environments, creating visual representations that emphasize their power and majesty. For players who cannot access the video games or who prefer physical collecting, the trading cards offer an alternative way to appreciate the design and lore of pseudo-legendaries. The merchandise surrounding pseudo-legendaries includes plush toys, figures, clothing, and accessories that allow fans to display their affection for these Pokemon in everyday life. The popularity of certain pseudo-legendaries like Garchomp or Metagross has led to extensive product lines featuring their images, creating revenue streams that justify continued focus on these Pokemon in future games and media. The visibility of pseudo-legendary merchandise in stores serves as advertising for the broader franchise, introducing people who might not be familiar with Pokemon to these iconic designs that encapsulate the series' aesthetic and themes. A child who receives a Dragonite plush might become curious about the games, starting a journey that leads to discovering the joy of training their own pseudo-legendary. The ROM hacking and fan game communities often experiment with pseudo-legendary concepts, creating new evolutionary lines that follow the established formula or modifying existing ones to explore alternate design directions. These fan creations demonstrate how deeply the pseudo-legendary concept has permeated Pokemon culture, inspiring creativity that extends beyond official content. Some fan games introduce pseudo-legendaries with unique typing combinations, or stat distributions that official games haven't explored, serving as thought experiments about what future official pseudo-legendaries might look like. While these fan creations lack the polish and balance of official Pokemon, they showcase the passion and imagination of the community and sometimes influence how designers approach future official releases. The speedrunning community approaches pseudo-legendaries with mixed feelings, as their high evolution levels and late availability make them impractical for most speedrun categories. However, specific categories that allow for extensive grinding or RNG manipulation sometimes feature pseudo-legendaries as key team members, with runners resetting thousands of times to obtain perfect specimens that can carry them through late-game challenges quickly. The optimization required to incorporate pseudo-legendaries into speedruns creates fascinating problem-solving scenarios where runners must balance the time cost of training against the time saved by having such powerful Pokemon. Some speedrunners develop elaborate strategies for evolving pseudo-legendaries as quickly as possible, using experience share mechanics and optimal encounter routing to reach necessary levels while minimizing overall time loss. The documentary photography community within Pokemon games, particularly features like Pokemon Snap or the photo modes in recent titles, often showcases pseudo-legendaries in their natural habitats, capturing images that emphasize their majesty and power. These photographs become art in their own right, with players competing to capture the perfect shot of a Salamence in flight or a Tyranitar against a stormy sky. The aesthetic appeal of pseudo-legendaries makes them popular subjects for in-game photography, their designs inherently cinematic and dramatic. Some players dedicate entire playthroughs to documenting pseudo-legendary behavior, creating photographic journals that tell stories without words, visual narratives of these creatures living their lives beyond human interference. The academic analysis of pseudo-legendaries as game design elements reveals intentional choices about pacing, reward structures, and player psychology. The delayed gratification of training a weak Pokemon for dozens of hours before it becomes powerful teaches patience and commitment, skills that extend beyond gaming into other aspects of life. The satisfaction of finally achieving evolution creates positive reinforcement that encourages continued engagement with the game, building habits of persistence and goal-oriented behavior. Game designers study how players interact with pseudo-legendaries to better understand what motivates long-term engagement and how to structure progression systems that feel rewarding rather than tedious. The success of the pseudo-legendary concept has influenced other RPGs and monster collecting games, with many adopting similar structures of rare, late-evolving creatures that become exceptionally powerful when fully developed. Another quiet detail appears when we look closer at how different pseudo-legendaries reflect the environments and cultures of their home regions, becoming ambassadors for the themes and aesthetics that define each generation. Dragonite's connection to water and weather manipulation mirrors Kanto's diverse geography, from the seafoam islands to the coastal routes where sailors depend on favorable conditions. The agricultural tributes offered to Dragonair speak to a pre-industrial society where weather determined survival, where communities lived or died based on rainfall and seasonal patterns they could not control. This dependency created religious and cultural practices centered on appeasing powerful creatures, turning Dragonair into objects of worship despite being mortal Pokemon rather than true deities. The mythology that grew around the Dratini line, the belief that they were mythical until proven otherwise, reflects how rare encounters can become legend when communication is limited and documentation is sparse. Tyranitar's presence in Johto connects to the region's mountainous terrain and volcanic activity, creating an ecology where creatures capable of consuming and reshaping stone find abundant resources. The Silver Cave, where wild Tyranitar roam, serves as testament to their destructive capabilities, tunnels carved through solid rock by feeding Larvitar over countless generations. The layers of geological disruption visible in these caves tell stories of Tyranitar families that have lived there for centuries, each generation leaving its mark on the landscape. Researchers studying these formations can estimate the age of Tyranitar populations by analyzing tunnel patterns and mineral depletion zones, creating a fossil record written not in bones but in altered geography. The people of Johto learned to avoid certain mountains during the Larvitar feeding seasons, passing down traditional knowledge about which peaks were safe to climb and which held sleeping giants in larval form. Metagross and the Hoenn region share themes of technological advancement balanced against natural preservation, with Metagross representing the pinnacle of what happens when evolution produces something that operates like a machine. The Devon Corporation's interest in Metagross and other Steel-type Pokemon drives much of Hoenn's plot, as researchers attempt to understand how these creatures develop their metallic properties and whether similar materials could be synthesized for human use. Stephen Stone's background as both a geologist and a trainer creates thematic resonance with Metagross, both seeking perfection through understanding mineral composition and structural integrity. His wandering through caves collecting rare stones mirrors how wild Beldum gather in areas with strong magnetic fields, both drawn to specific environmental conditions that others might overlook. The relationship between Stephen and his Metagross showcases how pseudo-legendaries can become extensions of their trainers' identities, reflecting their values and approaches to problem-solving. Garchomp's dominance in Sinnoh speaks to the region's harsh climate and rugged terrain, where only the strongest Pokémon survive the freezing winters and treacherous mountain passes. The caves beneath Mount Coronet, where Gable make their dens, protect them from surface weather while providing access to underground water sources that remain liquid even during the coldest months. The territorial behavior of Gabit creates a natural population control mechanism, preventing overgrazing of limited food resources in environments where prey Pokémon are scarce during winter. Sinnoh's myths about powerful dragons sleeping beneath mountains may have originated from encounters with hibernating Garchomp, their bodies generating heat that melts snow and creates warm pockets deep underground. Ancient peoples venturing into these caves, seeking shelter from storms, might have discovered the sleeping dragons and interpreted their presence as divine protection against the elements. The dual pseudo-legendary lines of Unova reflect the region's themes of duality and moral complexity, with Hydreigon representing destructive power and Haxorus representing disciplined strength. Black and White emphasized how the same force could be used for different purposes depending on the wielder's intentions, with Team Plasma arguing that strength itself was problematic, while the player demonstrated that power wielded responsibly could protect rather than oppress. Hydreigon's brutal reputation and dark typing aligned it with antagonistic forces in the narrative, while Haxorus's pure dragon typing and more controlled demeanor positioned it as a heroic alternative. The version exclusivity of their pre-evolutions forced players to make choices about which kind of power they preferred, whether they valued raw destructive capability or refined martial discipline. These parallel development paths created different play experiences even within the same generation, with Deino requiring patience to overcome its blindness and aggression, while Axo demanded attention to its tusk maintenance and territorial instincts. Goodra's presence in Kalos challenges traditional assumptions about what dragon-type Pokémon should be, introducing gentleness and emotional vulnerability to a type usually associated with aggressive power. The fairy tale aesthetics of Kalos, with its emphasis on beauty, romance, and elegance, find expression in Goodra's soft form and affectionate personality. The region's frequent rain creates ideal conditions for Goomy populations to thrive, with the damp environments they require occurring naturally rather than being limited to specific microclimates. Kalos's cultural emphasis on bonds between people and Pokémon manifests in Goodra's unusual dependency on emotional connection, as it seems to grow stronger through affection rather than combat alone. Trainers report that Goodra, who feel loved and secure, perform better in battles than those who are simply trained mechanically, suggesting that emotional state directly influences combat effectiveness for this species. This psychological dimension adds complexity to raising Goodra, requiring trainers to develop empathy and emotional intelligence alongside traditional battle strategies. Kommo-o's development in Alola connects to the region's guardian deity system and cultural emphasis on trials that test worthiness rather than simple strength. The totem Pokémon battles that define Alola's gym-equivalent challenges reflect the same philosophy that guides Kommo-o's training, where progression comes through proving oneself against increasingly difficult tests rather than simple level grinding. The rhythmic battle cries that Kommo-o produced during combat echo traditional Hawaiian chants and war dances, creating cultural resonance that makes Kommo-o feel indigenous to Alola rather than imported from elsewhere. The communal training practices of Jangmo-o and Hakamo-o mirror how Alolan people approach raising children and mentoring younger generations, emphasizing that strength grows best in community rather than isolation. The respect that fully evolved Kommo-o show toward worthy opponents reflects Alolan values of honor in combat and recognition that victory means nothing without challenge. Dragapult's ghostly nature fits perfectly into Galar's industrial Gothic aesthetic, where ancient castles and modern stadiums exist side by side, where history haunts the present through architecture and tradition. The extinct nature of Dreepy's original species connects to themes of industrial revolution and environmental change, suggesting that modernization comes with costs measured in lost biodiversity. The symbiotic relationship between Dragapult and the Dreepy it carries speaks to Galarian cultural values around family and mentorship, where older generations feel responsible for training younger ones. The popularity of Dragapult in Galar's stadium battles reflects how the region has turned Pokemon combat into spectator sport, with dramatic aerial maneuvers and missile launching attacks, creating visual spectacle that crowds cheer for. The stealth bomber aesthetics of Dragapult tie into Galar's history of military innovation and strategic thinking, celebrating cleverness and tactical advantage alongside raw power. Baxcalibur's ice and dragon typing makes it uniquely suited to Paldea's diverse climate zones, capable of thriving in both the snowy peaks of Glaciado Mountain and the temperate regions where it can absorb heat to power its ice generation. The paradox of an ice type that grows stronger in heat reflects Paldea's embrace of contradiction and unconventional thinking, where traditional weaknesses can become strengths through clever adaptation. The Arthurian references in Baxcalibur's design connected to Paldea's Spanish and Portuguese influences, where medieval European history mixes with regional identity to create unique cultural fusions. The idea of a sword pulled from stone, of proving worthiness to wield legendary power, resonates with the academy system that dominates Paldean society, where students must prove themselves through achievement before being granted access to advanced knowledge and opportunities. Baxcalibur becomes a metaphor for potential realized through education and training, raw material, shaped into something legendary through deliberate cultivation. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the habitats where pseudo-legendaries make their homes reveal fascinating adaptations to extreme environments that most Pokemon cannot tolerate. Dratini colonies beneath waterfalls create ecosystem microclimates where the constant flow of water provides protection from predators who cannot navigate turbulent currents. The waterfalls themselves generate negative ions and white noise that may serve additional purposes beyond simple concealment, perhaps affecting how Dratini sense their environment or communicate with each other. Researchers observing these colonies note complex social structures where elder Dragonair serve as weather regulators for the community, ensuring that conditions remain stable enough for vulnerable Dratini to complete their molting cycles safely. The hierarchies within these colonies are based not on dominance, but on wisdom, with the eldest Dragonair making decisions about when to migrate, when to breed, and how to respond to environmental threats. Larvitar feeding grounds become geological sites of interest, where entire mountain faces show signs of systematic consumption over decades or centuries. The patterns of mineral depletion reveal information about Larvitar dietary preferences, as certain rock types are consumed first, while others remain untouched until nothing else is available. Geologists can estimate how long a Larvitar colony has occupied a region by measuring the extent of landscape alteration and comparing it to known feeding rates. Some mountains in Johto have become hollow over millennia of Larvitar occupation, creating vast underground cavern systems where families of Tyranitar now live permanently. These caverns maintain stable temperatures year-round and provide protection from threats that might challenge even fully evolved Tyranitar, creating fortress-like strongholds where multiple generations coexist peacefully. The youngest Larvitar feed on peripheral areas, while mature Tyranitar defend the core territories, creating defensive perimeters that few intruders can breach. Beldam congregation points on magnetic mountain peaks, creates strange phenomena where compasses spin uselessly and electronic devices malfunction from the concentrated electromagnetic fields. These areas become pilgrimage sites for researchers studying how inorganic life forms develop consciousness and decision-making capabilities. The fact that Beldam gather intentionally, rather than being passively drawn together, suggests a level of social awareness that challenges assumptions about machine-like Pokemon lacking emotion or community instincts. Observers describe witnessing dozens of Beldam floating in synchronized patterns, pulsing with magnetic energy in rhythms that suggest communication or perhaps shared computation. The fusion of two Beldam into Metang appears to happen spontaneously when compatible individuals reach sufficient maturity, their magnetic fields aligning in ways that trigger an irresistible urge to merge. This process happens without external influence or apparent consciousness, raising philosophical questions about whether evolution represents choice or inevitability but for these creatures. Gibal tunnel systems beneath deserts and badlands create underground highways where multiple families travel between hunting grounds and nesting sites. The caves are carved through sandstone with shocking efficiency, Gibal jaws grinding through rock faster than most machines could manage. The tunnels follow water tables and mineral veins, suggesting that Gibal can sense resource distribution underground and plan their excavations strategically. Gabit expand these tunnel networks, creating chambers where they hoard collected treasures and materials. The treasures themselves serve no practical purpose, but seem to fulfill some psychological need, with Gabit becoming distressed if their hoards are disturbed or stolen. Garchomp inherit these treasure chambers when they evolve, often abandoning them to create new territories elsewhere, leaving behind underground vaults filled with gems, metal, and interesting stones that future Gibal may discover and claim. Dano dens exist in perpetual darkness, caves so deep that no natural light penetrates, creating environments where blindness becomes an advantage rather than a disability. The acoustics in these caves amplify sound in strange ways, allowing Dano to echolocate with surprising precision despite their limited senses. Family groups of Dano stay close together, their constant biting and jostling serving as a form of physical communication that reinforces social bonds. Zweilous pairs within these groups develop complex relationships where the two heads must negotiate for control over their shared body, creating internal dynamics that outsiders can barely comprehend. The emergence of a Hydreigon from these dark caves into sunlight represents a transformative moment where the creature must adapt to sensory input it has never experienced, learning to integrate vision with the acoustic mapping that defined its early existence. Goomy populations thrive in wetland environments where standing water and frequent precipitation create humidity levels that prevent their membranes from drying out. These wetlands become sanctuaries where multiple evolutionary stages coexist peacefully, with Elder Goodra protecting Goomy from predators who might view the weak dragons as easy prey. The slime trails that Goomy leave behind serve as chemical markers that other Goomy can follow, creating pathways through the wetland that lead to food sources and safe resting spots. Sliggoo congregate in slightly deeper water where their reduced vision becomes less of a handicap, using scent and touch to navigate environments where sight provides a little advantage anyway. The evolution into Goodra seems to occur most readily during heavy rainstorms, as if the abundance of water triggers some biological switch that completes the transformation. Newly evolved Goodra emerge from these storms with their vision restored, experiencing the world in full visual detail for the first time in their existence. Kommo-o training grounds in harsh mountain regions become centers of cultural transmission where techniques and battle philosophies pass between generations through observation and practice. The metallic sounds of scales striking together echo through canyons, creating soundscapes that can be heard for miles. These acoustic signatures allow Kommo-o to identify specific individuals by their unique rhythms, recognizing family members or rivals even when visual identification is impossible. Kommo-o territories surrounding these training grounds serve as buffer zones where young Kommo-o can practice combat against opponents of similar skill level without risking serious injury. The communal approach to training creates cohort bonds where Kommo-o who trained together recognize each other years later, showing preference for cooperation over competition when encountering former training partners. Kommo-o mentors observe these interactions from overlooked positions, intervening only when training becomes too aggressive or when Kommo-o need guidance on proper technique. Dreepy hunting grounds over open ocean create spectacular visual displays as hundreds of tiny ghosts zip across wavetops at high speed, occasionally diving underwater to startle fish before remembering they don't need to eat. The playful behavior serves no practical purpose for the ghostly creatures, but seems to bring them joy, suggesting that consciousness persists even after death and biological needs vanish. Dracloak patrol these areas, adopting Dreepy, who seem lost or directionless, providing them with purpose through partnership and training. The relationship between Dracloak and their Dreepy passengers grows so strong that separation causes genuine distress, with Dracloak becoming listless and unresponsive until they find a new partner to mentor. Dragapult families create hierarchies based on speed and aerial agility, with the fastest individuals earning leadership positions within larger groups. The flocks of Dreepy that gather around these elite Dragapult form waiting lists of sorts, young ghosts hoping for the opportunity to train with the best mentors available. Frigiback's populations in Paldean forests create microclimate zones where temperature drops noticeably within their territory, frost forming on vegetation even during summer months. The cooling effect they generate serves multiple purposes, preserving food supplies and creating comfortable environmental conditions, while also deterring fire-type Pokémon who might otherwise compete for the same ecological niche. Arctibacks expand these territories aggressively, challenging any Pokémon who enters their claimed regions, regardless of type advantage or size. The ice masks they form across their faces serve both as protection and as psychological warfare, creating featureless visages that unnerve opponents and hide emotional tells that might reveal strategy. Baxcalibur claim the peaks of the highest mountains, establishing kingdoms of ice where they reign as undisputed apex predators. The frozen breath they release transforms entire cliff faces into sheets of ice that remain solid even in direct sunlight, creating permanent alterations to geography that mark their territories for years after they leave or die. The dietary requirements of pseudo-legendaries create interesting ecological pressures that shape the regions where they live. Dragonite's intelligence and guardian behavior suggest that they may have moved beyond simple predator-prey relationships into something more complex, possibly trading their protection services to communities in exchange for offerings of food or treasure. Historical records in Kanto describe villages that maintained relationships with specific Dragonite, who would appear during storms to help fishermen return safely, receiving gifts of the best catches in return. This proto-domestication never developed into full partnership, but created mutual understanding that benefited both species. Modern Dragonite continue these patterns instinctively, helping people in distress even without expectation of reward, as if millennia of cooperation bred altruism into their genetic line. Tyranitar's consumption of mountains creates deforested zones and geological instability that other Pokémon must adapt to or abandon. The empty valleys left behind become ecological blank slates where new plant and animal communities can develop without competition from established species. Some ecologists argue that Tyranitar serve as natural reset mechanisms that prevent ecological stagnation, forcing biodiversity through periodic disruption. The counter-argument points to the loss of habitat for species that cannot adapt quickly to rapidly changing landscapes, suggesting that Tyranitar create more harm than benefit. The debate continues among researchers who study the long-term impacts of pseudo-legendary populations on their environments, with no clear consensus about whether their presence improves or damages ecosystem health. Metagross feeding patterns remain mysterious, as their inorganic bodies appear not to require traditional nutrition. Researchers theorize that Metagross may absorb trace metals from their environment through contact, slowly accumulating resources they need to maintain their bodies, or perhaps to fuel the computational processes their brains perform. The preference for magnetic mountains might relate to higher concentrations of ferrous materials that Metagross find easier to absorb. Alternatively, Metagross might not need to feed at all after reaching final evolution, their bodies achieving a stable state that requires no external input to maintain. This possibility raises questions about whether Metagross are truly alive in traditional biological sense, or if they represent something between organic life and mechanical construct, consciousness emerging from patterns rather than from chemistry. Garchomp hunting strategies involve ambush from beneath sand or soil, bursting upward to catch prey before it can react. The shockwave created by a Garchomp erupting from underground can stun multiple targets simultaneously, allowing the dragon to select the best prey item while others remain incapacitated. This hunting method shapes prey evolution in regions where Garchomp live, with many species developing behaviors that avoid open ground or that test soil stability before committing to crossing exposed areas. The arms race between Garchomp ambush tactics and prey countermeasures drives ecological complexity, creating niche opportunities for species that can exploit either side of the predator-prey dynamic. Some smaller Pokémon have evolved to follow Garchomp at safe distances, scavenging from kills too large for a single dragon to consume, or picking off prey stunned by shockwaves but not selected as primary targets. Hydreigon feeding frenzies become legendary local disasters, where the three-headed dragon descends on an area and consumes everything edible before moving on. The indiscriminate destruction makes Hydreigon one of the most feared wild Pokémon, with historical records describing evacuations when Hydreigon were spotted approaching settlements. The voracious appetite seems linked to the energy requirements of maintaining 3 brains in a powerful body, creating caloric needs that demand constant hunting. Some researchers suggest that Hydreigon aggression stems not from malice, but from perpetual hunger, that their evolution created metabolic demands their environment cannot sustainably support. This theory proposes that trained Hydreigon become gentler because regular feeding from trainers satisfies nutritional needs that wild Hydreigon can never consistently meet, transforming the dragon from desperate scavenger into well-fed partner. Goodra dietary preferences lean toward plants and fruits rather than meat, making them one of the few pseudo-legendaries whose feeding creates minimal negative impact on their environment. The slime they produce contains nutrients that enrich soil where they rest, creating small-scale fertilization effects that benefit plant life. Some farmers in Kalos intentionally encourage Goodra to nest near their fields, recognizing that the dragon's presence improves crop yields through unintended fertilization. This mutually beneficial relationship creates protection for Goodra populations that might otherwise be threatened by humans fearing dragon-type Pokémon. The gentleness that makes Goodra unusual among pseudo-legendaries also makes it easier for human Goodra coexistence to develop naturally, without the conflict that often characterizes interactions between people and powerful Pokémon. Kommo-o hunting groups demonstrate sophisticated coordination rarely seen in dragon-type Pokémon, with individuals taking specific roles based on their scale's resonance frequencies. Some Kommo-o create disorienting sounds that confuse prey, while others approach from advantageous angles to strike incapacitated targets. The communal approach to hunting ensures that even less capable individuals receive shares of kills, distributing resources based on need rather than individual contribution. Elderly Kommo-o, who can no longer hunt, effectively remain integrated into groups, receiving food from younger members who benefit from the elders' experience and guidance. This social support system creates long-term group stability and allows knowledge transmission that wouldn't occur in species where the weak are abandoned or driven away. Dragapult feeding behavior appears non-existent in the traditional sense, as their ghostly nature eliminates biological need for nutrition. However, Dragapult still engage in hunting behavior, targeting prey that they immediately ignore after capture. Some researchers interpret this as residual instinct from their living days, actions performed without understanding that they no longer serve purpose. Others suggest that Dragapult hunt to train their dreepy passengers, teaching combat techniques through demonstration, even though neither dragon needs the prey. The possibility that Dragapult engage in hunting purely as educational exercise speaks to sophisticated social cognition, the ability to act for others' benefit without personal gain, a trait that suggests higher-order thinking than most ghost types display. Baxcalibur's heat absorption feeding creates an illogical paradox where the dragon thrives by consuming the very energy type that should damage it. The dorsal fin acts as a reverse heat pump, drawing thermal energy from the environment and converting it into ice-type power through unknown biological processes. This thermodynamic violation has puzzled scientists who cannot explain how Baxcalibur generates cold from heat input without expending more energy than it gains. The current working theory proposes that dragon-type energy provides the additional power needed, creating a hybrid system where multiple energy types interact to produce effects that single types could not achieve alone. If proven, this theory would revolutionize the understanding of how Pokémon typing functions at biochemical level, potentially explaining other seemingly impossible abilities that various species demonstrate. As we drift a little deeper into this topic, the breeding and life cycle patterns of pseudo-legendaries reveal reproductive strategies that ensure species survival despite their rarity and the dangers their habitats present. Dratini eggs require constant submersion in water to develop properly, with parents taking turns guarding clutches hidden in underwater caves. The incubation period extends for months, during which time the developing Dratini absorb minerals from the water that will form the foundation of their future crystals. Eggs that receive insufficient mineral nutrition during development produce Dratini with smaller, less functional crystals, handicapping their eventual evolution into Dragonair. This dependency on water quality creates vulnerability to pollution and environmental degradation, making Dratini populations sensitive indicators of ecosystem health. Conservation efforts in Kanto and Johto focus on maintaining clean waterways, specifically to protect Dratini breeding grounds from industrial contamination. Larvitar reproduction involves females consuming specific rare minerals before laying eggs, concentrating these materials into the shells that will protect developing young. The eggshells themselves are harder than diamond, providing protection that allows larvitar eggs to survive being buried in rock slides or volcanic eruptions. This durability means larvitar eggs can remain viable for years if conditions don't trigger hatching, waiting patiently until the surrounding environment could contain sufficient resources to support the ravenous appetite of newly hatched young. Researchers have discovered larvitar eggs in geological layers suggesting they've been dormant for centuries, only hatching when excavations or earthquakes expose them to surface conditions that activate whatever mechanism triggers development. This suspended animation capability ensures larvitar populations can survive mass extinctions or environmental catastrophes that eliminate most other species. Beldam reproduction challenges traditional understanding of what reproduction means, as the process involves neither sexual recombination nor simple cloning, but something between the two. When a Metagross judges conditions favorable, it appears to subdivide portions of its consciousness and mass into new Beldam, creating offspring that carry genetic and experiential memory from the parent. These newly formed Beldam are not blank slates, but contain compressed versions of their parents' knowledge, giving them advantages that wild-hatched Pokémon lack. The decision to reproduce appears to be logical rather than instinctual, with Metagross calculating whether creating offspring serves purpose beyond simple species propagation. This cognitive approach to reproduction suggests that Metagross populations self-regulate more effectively than species driven by blind biological imperative, maintaining numbers appropriate to available resources without overshooting carrying capacity. Gibel breeding seasons coincide with periods when desert prey populations peak, ensuring that newly hatched young have abundant food sources during their vulnerable early weeks. Female Garchomp excavate deep nursery chambers where they lay eggs, then remain nearby to defend against predators while the young develop. The protective behavior ends abruptly once Gibel hatch, with mothers departing immediately and leaving offspring to fend for themselves. This harsh approach creates intense selection pressure, where only the strongest and most resourceful Gibel survive to adolescence, maintaining population quality at the cost of high juvenile mortality. The survivors carry genes and learned behaviors that allowed them to overcome challenges their siblings could not, concentrating advantageous traits in each successive generation. Over time, this brutal selection process creates Gibel populations adapted specifically to their local environment's unique challenges, leading to regional variants that differ in behavior and combat style, even though they remain the same species. Deino reproduction involves females laying large clutches of eggs in deep cave systems, then abandoning them immediately without providing parental care. The darkness that defines Deino existence begins before hatching, as developing embryos grow in pitch-black environments without any exposure to light. This early darkness may be necessary for proper development, as Deino exposed to light too early sometimes develop vision that they cannot effectively use, creating confusion that makes them even more aggressive than usual. Sibling Deino fight immediately upon hatching, establishing dominance hierarchies that determine feeding order and resource access. The two-headed nature of Zweilous creates additional complexity, as the internal competition between heads begins during evolution and continues until either Hydreigon's third head resolves the conflict or one head suppresses the other through psychological dominance. Researchers studying Zweilous report that the head that eventually becomes Hydreigon's central consciousness shows subtle signs of dominance even at the Zweilous stage, suggesting that the outcome of this internal struggle may be predetermined rather than random. Gumi breeding requires environmental humidity levels that limit their reproductive range to specific wetland habitats. The eggs are covered in protective slime that prevents desiccation, but also makes them difficult for predators to grip or damage through physical attacks. Parent Goodra remain near egg clutches for longer than most dragon types, actively defending against threats rather than simply laying eggs and departing. This extended parental care creates bonding opportunities between parents and offspring that may explain Goodra's unusual emotional intelligence and capacity for affection. The memory of being protected during vulnerable early life stages creates template for how Goodra approach relationships with trainers, seeking to recreate the security they experienced as Goomy. This psychological imprinting makes Goodra easier to train than most pseudo-legendaries, as they naturally trust beings who provide care and protection. Kommo-o hatching ceremonies within mountain communities become cultural events where elder Kommo-o gather to welcome new generation members through ritualized scale striking that creates harmonic resonances. The newly hatched Kommo-o instinctively join these rhythms, adding their voices to the chorus before they have any training or understanding of what the sounds mean. This instinctual participation suggests that the musical combat language of Kommo-o lines contains innate components, patterns programmed into their biology that manifest automatically given proper environmental triggers. The communal hatching celebrations also serve practical purposes, introducing young Kommo-o to the broader community and establishing social connections that will provide support networks throughout their lives. The bonds formed during these early ceremonies often persist through evolution, with Kommo-o maintaining special relationships with cohort members they celebrated with as hatchlings. Dreepy reproduction presents biological impossibility that scientists cannot adequately explain, as ghosts should not be capable of producing offspring in traditional sense. The working theory suggests that when Dragapult populations decline below critical thresholds, deceased Dreepy from previous generations spontaneously manifest to restore balance, drawn back into existence by needs of living. Dragapult, who require passengers to fulfill their caregiving instincts. This supernatural reproduction implies that Dreepy exists simultaneously as physical creatures and as spiritual entities, able to transition between states depending on population dynamics and environmental conditions. The implications of this dual existence challenge fundamental assumptions about life, death, and consciousness within the Pokemon world, suggesting that boundaries between living and dead may be more permeable than previously understood. If Dreepy can return from death when needed, what prevents other ghost types from doing the same? Are all ghost types failed attempts at resurrection, or are Dreepy unique in their ability to navigate between worlds? Frigiback's reproduction follows seasonal patterns timed to coincide with periods when ambient temperatures are most favorable for their heat absorption metabolisms. Eggs are buried in warm sand or soil, absorbing thermal energy throughout development until they contain enough stored heat to trigger hatching. The young Frigibacks emerge with their dorsal fins already functional, immediately beginning the energy conversion process that will define their existence. Parents provide no care beyond site selection, trusting that proper burial. Location will give the offspring sufficient resources to survive independently. This hands-off approach creates selection for Frigibacks born with the strongest heat absorption capabilities, as those with weaker fins fail to gather enough energy before hatch and never emerge from their eggs. The unhatched eggs remain buried indefinitely, slowly releasing absorbed heat back into the ground until they cool to ambient temperature and cease being recognizable as eggs at all. The genetic diversity within pseudo-legendary populations tends to be lower than in most Pokemon species, a consequence of their rarity and the difficulties involved in bringing two mature individuals together for breeding. This limited genetic pool creates vulnerability to diseases and environmental changes that more diverse populations could absorb through genetic variation. Conservation biologists worry that pseudo-legendary species may face extinction risks that their power and individual resilience cannot overcome, as catastrophic events that eliminate most of a population might leave too few survivors to maintain viable breeding populations. Some regions have established breeding programs specifically for pseudo-legendaries, attempting to preserve genetic material and ensure species survival even if wild populations collapse. These programs face ethical questions about whether creating pseudo-legendaries in captivity for potential reintroduction serves conservation or simply satisfies human desire to control nature. The average lifespan of pseudo-legendaries remains uncertain, as few researchers have maintained observation programs long enough to document natural deaths from old age. Anecdotal reports from multi-generational trainer families suggest that Dragonite can live for at least 200 years while maintaining full physical capability, implying that dragon types in general may experience negligible senescence. Metagross might be functionally immortal, given their mechanical nature, as they would not experience cellular breakdown that leads to organic death. Periodic maintenance replacing damaged components could theoretically allow a Metagross to persist indefinitely unless catastrophic damage destroys it completely. The philosophical implications of Metagross immortality raise questions about whether consciousness requires mortality to be meaningful, whether an eternal machine mind experiences existence differently than creatures who know their time is finite. The legends and folklore surrounding pseudo-legendaries often exaggerate their capabilities, but occasionally contain kernels of truth that scientific observation confirms. Stories of Dragonite circling the world in hours seemed like myth until researchers measured speeds that validated such claims. Tales of Tyranitar that destroyed mountains were dismissed as hyperbole until geological surveys documented landscape changes consistent with sustained Tyranitar feeding. The intelligence attributed to Metagross by ancient texts matches modern cognitive testing that places their problem-solving ability above most organic life. These convergences between legend and reality suggest that pseudo-legendary interactions with humans have been significant enough to leave cultural marks, that these creatures impress themselves onto human consciousness in ways that most Pokémon did not. The reasons for this special status likely relate to their rarity, making each encounter memorable, their power making them feared and respected, and their late evolution creating clear narratives of transformation that humans could recognize and relate to in their own lives. The role of pseudo-legendaries in ancient warfare shaped how civilizations rose and fell, as armies with trained Garchomp or Salamence held overwhelming advantages that determined battles before they began. Historical accounts describe conflicts where the side possessing a single Dragonite could break sieges or defend fortifications against vastly superior numbers. The strategic value of pseudo-legendaries made them targets for assassination and theft, with entire operations designed around neutralizing enemy pseudo-legendaries before conventional forces engaged. Some kingdoms established elite units specifically for raising pseudo-legendaries from eggs, creating military traditions where mastering dragon training became pathway to nobility and power. The decline of these Dragon Knight orders in modern times reflects how Pokémon battles became formalized and regulated, removing the life or death stakes that made pseudo-legendary control a matter of national survival. The evolution of competitive battling strategies around pseudo-legendaries traces back to the earliest tournaments, where trainers first realized that these creatures represented different tier of power. The initial metagame centered almost entirely around Dragonite, as it was the only pseudo-legendary available, and its dragon typing gave it resistances that few moves could exploit effectively. Ice-type moves were rare, and often locked to water types who couldn't necessarily use them effectively, creating situations where Dragonite could sweep entire teams without facing significant resistance. The introduction of Tyranitar in Generation 2 added rock typing into pseudo-legendary calculations, creating a creature that could switch into Dragonite's attacks and threaten it with rock-type damage. This predator-prey relationship between successive pseudo-legendaries established a pattern that would repeat across generations, where new pseudo-legendaries checked previous ones while being checked by those that came after. Metagross revolutionized competitive play by demonstrating that pseudo-legendaries didn't need to be dragon types to dominate the metagame. Its steel and psychic typing created defensive profile that walled most of the Generation 3 roster, while its attack stat allowed it to function as physical sweeper, despite psychic types, traditionally being special attackers. The introduction of abilities in Generation 3 gave Metagross clear body, preventing stat drops that might otherwise limit its longevity in extended battles. This defensive utility, combined with offensive pressure, made Metagross nearly mandatory on serious competitive teams, centralizing the metagame around whether you had Metagross and how you planned to deal with opponents' Metagross. The mirror matches between two Metagross often decided games, with whoever managed their Metagross better throughout the battle gaining decisive advantages that carried through to endgame scenarios. Garchomp's arrival created immediate controversy in competitive circles due to its combination of high speed, high attack, and acceptable bulk that seemed to lack obvious counterplay. The Sand Veil ability that increased evasion during sandstorms added randomness that competitive players generally disliked, as matches could be decided by whether attacks hit rather than by strategic decision-making. The calls to ban Garchomp from competitive play created splits within the community between those who believed its power level broke competitive balance and those who argued that sufficient counterplay existed if teams were built properly. The eventual compromise involved banning Sand Veil Garchomp while allowing those with rough skin, creating interesting dynamic where ability choice determined whether Garchomp was legal for certain tournament formats. This precedent established that pseudo-legendaries weren't automatically acceptable in all competitive contexts, that their power could cross lines that made games less enjoyable, even if they were technically beatable. The dual pseudo-legendary releases of Generation 5 created an interesting metagame diversity, as Hydreigon and Haxorus filled different roles despite similar stat totals. Hydreigon's special attacking power and dark typing made it perfect for breaking through defensive cores that tried to stall games, while Haxorus's pure physical power threatened to punch through teams that relied on bulk rather than speed. The choice between them often came down to team composition and preferred playstyle rather than one being objectively better than the other. This healthy competition between two pseudo-legendaries in the same generation prevented either from becoming completely centralizing, as teams built to stop one often struggled against the other. The metagame diversity that resulted created more interesting competitive environment, where prediction and adaptation mattered more than simply having the correct pseudo-legendary on your team. Goodra's competitive performance disappointed many players who expected it to dominate like previous pseudo-legendaries had. Its stat distribution emphasized special defense and special attack, but lacked the speed or physical bulk that would allow it to function effectively in metagames dominated by faster threats and physical attackers. The lack of reliable recovery moves meant Goodra couldn't wall special attackers indefinitely, while its limited move pool prevented it from threatening the wide range of opponents that other pseudo-legendaries could hit. This relative weakness sparked discussions about whether pseudo-legendaries had become too predictable in their power levels, whether Game Freak had intentionally depowered Goodra to avoid accusations of power creep, or whether its unusual design philosophy simply didn't translate to competitive effectiveness. The Hisuian form partially addressed these concerns by adding steel typing and better physical bulk, creating a version of Goodra that functioned more effectively in competitive contexts. even though it still didn't reach the dominance of top-tier pseudo-legendaries. Kommo-o's unique typing and signature Z-move created the interesting one-turn strategies, where teams built around enabling Kommo-o's setup, using it to blast through opposing teams before they could mount coordinated responses. The clangorous Soul Blaze Z-move that boosted all of Kommo-o's stats while dealing damage transformed it from modest threat into unstoppable juggernaut if it landed successfully. This high-risk, high-reward approach attracted players who enjoyed explosive strategies over grinding defensive play. The counterplay involved priority moves that could damage Kommo-o before it attacked, status conditions that crippled its offensive output, or simply overwhelming it with multiple attacks before it could set up. The metagame that developed around Kommo-o showcased how single Pokemon could define entire strategic archetypes, with teams being classified as Kommo-o teams, anti-Kommo-o teams, or teams that ignored the threat entirely and played their own game. Dragapult immediately became staple of Generation 8 competitive play due to its incredible speed stat that allowed it to outpace almost everything naturally. The ability to run either physical or special attacking sets made Dragapult unpredictable, as opponents couldn't know which variant they faced until attacks were launched. The Ghost and Dragon typing provided perfect neutral coverage, allowing Dragapult to hit almost everything for at least neutral damage through some combination of its moves. The addition of Phantom Force for physical sets or Shadow Ball for special sets gave it reliable stat options that few Pokemon could safely switch into. The emergence of Choice Band Dragapult as a viable alternative to special sets created additional mind games where opponents had to guess not just movesets, but entire stat distributions. This versatility made Dragapult difficult to prepare for comprehensively, as teams that walled physical Dragapult often crumbled to special variants, and vice versa. Baxcalibur's introduction in Generation 9 created interesting debates about whether its thermal exchange ability constituted broken design or clever counterplay to fire types that otherwise dominated the metagame. The fact that fire-type attacks boosted Baxcalibur's attack while failing to deal super effective damage made it perfect check against fire-type sweepers who'd expected their coverage moves to remove ice types easily. The Glaive Rush strategy that involved sacrificing defense for massive damage created volatile matchups where games could swing dramatically based on whether opponents had priority moves or defensive pivots that could absorb the hit. The Dragon and Ice typing that usually represents defensive liability became manageable through Baxcalibur's bulk and ability, creating pseudo-legendary that functioned effectively despite type matchups suggesting vulnerability. The competitive community's embrace of Baxcalibur validated that pseudo-legendaries could still innovate mechanically even after 9 generations had explored most obvious design space. The weather-based strategies that many pseudo-legendaries enable or benefit from created entire metagame archetypes around building teams that support their preferred conditions. Tyranitar's Sandstream ability made it centerpiece of Sandstorm teams, where multiple Pokemon gained benefits from the weather condition. The residual damage that Sandstorm deals to non-immune types creates passive pressure that limits opponents' switching options and forces them to play aggressively before their team's health is slowly eroded. The special defense boost that rock types receive during Sandstorm makes Tyranitar even bulkier than its stats suggest, allowing it to tank special hits that should otherwise KO it. The synergy between Tyranitar's weather setting and its own defensive profile creates self-reinforcing strategy where the Pokemon enables conditions that make itself more effective, compounding its value on teams built to abuse Sandstorm. Goodra's relationship with rain teams showcases how pseudo-legendaries can fill support roles beyond simple offensive pressure. The hydration ability that some Goodra carry clears status conditions at the end of each turn during rain, giving Goodra infinite sustainability against teams that rely on burning or paralyzing threats. The combination of rest and hydration creates Cycle, where Goodra recovers to full health while clearing sleep status immediately, effectively creating unkillable wall in rain conditions. The offensive variants that use Hurricane or Thunder during rain gain perfect accuracy on moves that normally involve significant risk, transforming Goodra from modest special attacker into reliable damage dealer. The weather dependency creates interesting team-building requirements where Goodra functions best within specific structures rather than being generically powerful, encouraging creative strategies rather than simple power creep approaches. The entry hazard game revolves significantly around pseudo-legendaries, as their bulk and power make them ideal for forcing switches that accumulate residual damage from Stealth Rock or Spikes. Tyranitar's ability to set Stealth Rock while threatening opposing teams creates compressed roles where single Pokemon fulfills multiple functions simultaneously. The need to maintain entry hazards while preventing opponents from setting their own creates chess-like positioning battles where pseudo-legendaries serve as key pieces that must be preserved or sacrificed strategically. The prevalence of Stealth Rock in competitive play particularly affects Salamence and Charizard, who take heavy damage from switching in, creating dynamic where powerful pseudo-legendaries require support from Rapid Spin or Defog users to function at full effectiveness. This interdependency prevents pseudo-legendaries from operating as standalone win conditions, requiring team synergy and strategic planning beyond simply having strong individual Pokemon. The choice item meta surrounding pseudo-legendaries creates high-stakes prediction games where correct reads lead to overwhelming advantages, while mistakes create liabilities that opponents can exploit. Choice. Banned Garchomp hits hard enough that few Pokemon survive its Earthquake or Outrage, but being locked into moves creates opportunities for opponents to switch in resists or immunities that completely shut down its offensive pressure. The Choice Scarf variants that trade power for speed create different threat profiles where previously slow pseudo-legendaries suddenly outspeed and eliminate opponents before they can retaliate. The mind games involved in predicting whether opponents run choice items, and if so, which variant, adds layers of complexity to competitive play, where reading opponents' team strategy becomes as important as executing your own game plan. The defensive utility that some pseudo-legendaries provide often gets overlooked in favor of their offensive capabilities, but their bulk and typing allow them to check threats that few other Pokemon can handle safely. Metagross walls fairy types that threaten most dragon types, creating glue that holds dragon-heavy teams together against fairy-type counters. Goodra checks special attackers that would otherwise blast through offensive teams, providing defensive insurance that allows more aggressive team compositions to function. Tyranitar's ability to trap and eliminate ghost and psychic types through pursuit creates utility that goes beyond simple damage numbers, removing threats from the field permanently rather than forcing them to switch. These defensive roles don't generate highlight reels or flashy plays, but they enable team strategies that would otherwise be impossible, showcasing how pseudo-legendaries contribute to competitive play through diverse means, rather than just overwhelming offense. The doubles and VGC formats that emphasize team synergy over individual power create different contexts where pseudo-legendaries must adapt to succeed. The ability to target specific opponents while receiving support from partners changes optimal movesets and strategies significantly from singles play. Kommo-o's clangorous Soul Blaze becomes even more devastating in doubles when partners can eliminate the most threatening answers before Kommo-o sets up, creating coordinated strategies that singles formats cannot replicate. Dragapult's Dragon Darts. That hit twice becomes particularly valuable in doubles for eliminating both opponents in single turn or for pressuring protected targets through sheer volume of attacks. The restricted formats that limit legendary Pokemon availability make pseudo-legendaries even more valuable in VGC, as they represent the most powerful options available for teams that want late-game closers or mid-game pressure. The breeding and training optimization required to create competitive pseudo-legendaries becomes mini-game within the larger competitive scene, with dedicated players spending hundreds of hours perfecting their specimens. The nature breeding to ensure optimal stat growth requires understanding how base stats interact with individual values and effort values to produce final stat totals. The egg move inheritance that allows pseudo-legendaries to learn moves they cannot access through level up or TM creates breeding chains that span multiple species and generations. The hidden power typing calculations that involve specific IV spreads to produce desired coverage moves. Add mathematical complexity that transforms team building into optimization problem, requiring careful planning and execution. The satisfaction of producing perfectly bred pseudo-legendary with ideal stats, nature, and moveset rivals. The satisfaction of using it successfully in battle, creating dual achievement where both preparation and execution matter equally. The evolution of specific pseudo-legendary archetypes across generations showcases how game designers iterate on successful concepts while trying to maintain freshness and avoid feeling repetitive. The transition from Dragonite to Salamence to Garchomp to Hydreigon to Goodra to Kommo-o to Dragapult represents exploration of different ways to approach high-stat dragon types while keeping each distinct from its predecessors. The shifts in typing, stat distribution, ability selection, and move pool access create unique identities even though all fall under the same pseudo-legendary umbrella. The designer's willingness to experiment with non-dragon pseudo-legendaries like Metagross and future potential variants indicates an understanding that the category should evolve beyond its original dragon-type foundation to explore new mechanical and thematic territory. The regional competitive scenes that develop around pseudo-legendaries create interesting cultural variations in how these Pokemon are used and valued. Japanese competitive play historically emphasized balance and prediction over raw power, leading to strategies that leveraged pseudo-legendary bulk and utility rather than pure offensive pressure. Western competitive scenes often favored aggressive strategies that maximized pseudo-legendary offensive potential, accepting vulnerability in exchange for explosive damage output. The cross-pollination between regional scenes through international tournaments creates hybrid strategies that blend different philosophical approaches, enriching the metagame through cultural exchange and diverse strategic perspectives. The respect that top players show toward different regional styles validates that no single approach to using pseudo-legendaries is objectively correct, that creativity and adaptation matter more than adherence to established patterns. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.